One thing you've got to realise about Australia's rainfall, and particularly the water movement through our rivers, is that it always goes through these patterns of we have a lot of water and then we don't have too much. So what that allows us to do is actually to concentrate on these different periods. So if we're coming in through into a dry, it's going to be really neat to see how the rivers actually respond to a drying pattern. But more importantly, we'll be setting ourselves up for the next wet period. So it's these two big disturbances that we are really quite keyed into, and it makes our river systems unique. You don't get it anywhere else. The way that I look at it, an analogy is that is just a part of the irregular heartbeat of our rivers and of our landscape. So there will be long periods of not doing a lot, then long periods of doing a hell of a lot, just like the wallabies. Unfortunately, we're in a low period. Let's not talk about that. But yeah, that is really quite unique. And it's part of that longer term variability that as a river scientist or a landscape scientist, that really turns me on. Okay, because that long-term variability is the key to make our landscape, our rivers, really, really productive. Our rivers are actually responded quite well from it. Yeah, definitely. And it wasn't all doom and gloom. But the other thing that we've noticed is that sometimes the way they respond to that long drought or that disturbance is changing slightly. So what it says to me is that even though we're in a wet period, we need to be gearing up for the next drought. If we're in a drought, we need to be gearing up to when it's going to be really wet. So the way we manage these things, the way we study these things, have got to be much longer than what we normally think of. That is a really interesting question, okay, and that is how we perceive our landscape operating. That is the typical paradigm, okay, for someone from the Northern Hemisphere. It's that annual cycle. Unfortunately, we don't work like that in Australia, so we need to take a much longer term perspective. Can we learn from a drought that happened for a year? Yes, we can, but the thing is, it's just a small part. We need to be having a much longer term, much longer term. Definitely. Okay. You imagine yourself and your psyche. If you're under pressure for a year, you could bounce back really quickly. But if I put pressure on you for 5 years, you're going to respond differently over that prolonged stress. But more importantly, how you bounce back from that stress is also going to be different. So it's that tempo, that time scale, which is really quite important. It's resilience, and that is, what is the capacity to bounce back after a disturbance? So if that disturbance, that stress, that drought has been there for a year, we're more likely to bounce back really quickly. But if it's been sustained, okay, how quickly do we bounce back? Do we bounce back in the same manner? Do the certain things cut in at the same time? All those types of things that we might take for granted, okay, we are just starting to get a handle on now. Good research. Yeah, obviously a lot of it's actually to do field work, but also to invest in good capacity building. You know, I'm not getting any younger, so we need to train new PhD students, but also postdocs and other younger scientists coming through. So it is, for us, it's a unique opportunity to do longer term research, but also to establish good capacity building work that we do here at UNE. What we really wanted to know is how well floodplain areas will bounce back after prolonged droughts, how stressed some of the aquatic organisms, particularly fish, are, and can they bounce back, or how well they bounce back. These are types of things that we don't know. The interesting thing is that the grant that we've got, these series of grants, allows us to cement the bridges that we have with our international collaborators, people in the US EPA, and the US Geological Survey that we've been working with now for a couple of years, it allows us to really use those bridges that we've been building, but also to use their techniques, okay, in a different environment. And look, we've been training with them, and now we've got the opportunity to go out there and really try it. Two things. The first one is we don't have the luxury of going to a bookshelf and pulling out a textbook on Australian rivers, how they function, the way they operate, but how we actually manage them that is sympathetic to the way they go. We don't have that textbook. So these grants that we've got over the next 5 years will allow us to develop not one, but a whole textbook on how Australian rivers work and how they're really quite unique. The second, we're doing that knowing that we want this information to be used, not just useful. So with that in mind, that extension and the knowledge exchange into management is really quite important. But again, our applied science is the key to the way we do things here at UNE. I was fortunate to be elected as president of the International Society for River Scientists in Beijing in China, which is a very big honour. First time they've given it to someone down under. And I was also elected as a research fellow of the Chinese Academy of Sciences to focus on rivers as well. It's a big deal. River science is a new emerging area. It has amazing inputs to the way that we manage rivers and water. But look, all our rivers across the globe are under pressure, and the only way to manage them and make sure that they're around for future generations is to work together. Wow. Oh, they have some great toys. You know, like, the degree of investment in river research in Australia is minimal compared to what they do in China, what they do in Europe and the USA. But the interesting thing about those rivers in China, Europe, and in the US is that under potential climate change, they're going to become more like Australian rivers. So we're at the thin edge of the wedge in terms of looking at systems that are going to become more variable and unpredictable, and therefore the challenges of managing that. What do we learn from them? They have got some very nice techniques on really to get down into the nitty-gritty on how things respond to disturbance like drought in rivers. We can actually learn and apply those new techniques in a completely new environmental setting.